many of you have heard something about the subject of the book, Eliza Winston? Oh, good. So, I had never heard of Eliza Winston before I moved here 22 years ago, and I was introduced to her by reading William Greene's excellent book, A Peculiar Imbalance. I believe her story is either in chapter 1 or chapter 2 of his book. And everything that I knew about Eliza Winston before starting my own research was from his book. So, what I wanted to do with my book was to figure out what Eliza's life of enslavement was like, and what events from that life would have driven her to push for her freedom as strongly as she did when she was in Minnesota. In my research, one thing that I was able to find out in greater detail was the amount of agency that she was able to have within her enslavement. Now, in her affidavit for her freedom hearing in Minneapolis, which is the only surviving document of her in her own words, she mentions that she was able to work in Memphis, Tennessee during her enslavement, and that the person who enslaved her at the time allowed her to marry, even though the marriage would not have been considered legal at that time. And that he had purchased some real estate for Eliza and her husband. So what I wanted to do was to make sure that I could find documents that would corroborate what she was saying in the affidavit. And I was on page 73. Sometime between July 1852 and March 1853, Eliza and her spouse bought one lot of land and a house with their savings. Quote, "My husband and myself worked hard, and he invested our savings in a house and lot in Memphis, which was held for us in Mr. Golson's name," she recalled years later. Mr. Golson being one of the people who enslaved Eliza. Golson's handling of this purchase demonstrated both trust and necessity. Tennessee law prohibited African Americans from making real estate transactions. The couple then leased out the property for $8 per month, and Golson collected the money from whomever rented it. Eliza recalled years later that the property was, quote, "held for us in Mr. Golson's name," but she considered marital acquisitions as joint ones in practice. Full manumission promised to make them de jure joint acquisitions too. Indeed, city tax records over the next 2 years recorded Golson as owning real estate in Memphis's 6th Ward, South Memphis, at a value of $1,000. It was the only land he held in his own name after moving back to Memphis. Eliza probably worked in others' homes as either a babysitter or a caretaker for someone sick or infirm. She knew how much money employers paid for that work in the city. She recalled years later that in Memphis, women performing such labor, working as a nurse girl, as she put it, usually earned $10 to $15 per month. She had plenty of experience for the position, having served multiple babies of enslavers, and having provided palliative care for Kate, who was Mr. Golson's wife before her passing. Eliza's hired-out employment for funding her manumission was common among antebellum African-American women. They did not define freedom as the absence of work, but rather as their ability to control the nature of their labor. Semi-freedom allowed Eliza to work to earn the manumission fee instead of merely performing tasks that the enslavers did. So by manumission fee, what I'm referring to is that Mr. Golson worked out an arrangement with Eliza that she could work outside of the enslaver's house and earn money and then pay for her freedom, according to the fee that Mr. Golson set. State officials in Tennessee had soured on adding free African Americans to the state's population. In 1851, the state enacted a new law which required all newly manumitted people to immigrate to Liberia within 2 years of their manumission. The law did not apply to Eliza's husband, who was already free. "We are in favor of a law compelling every free Negro to leave the state," explained a supporter for the local newspaper, "for we consider every free Negro a common nuisance, to be summarily dealt with as such in a slaveholding community. Any person failing to comply with the law faced possible re-enslavement. In preceding years, Memphis residents relocating to Liberia had needed to travel to Georgia in the spring and board a steamboat that sailed from the Gulf Coast and across the Atlantic Ocean to their destination. At some point in 1852 or 1853, Eliza's husband made this trip with other freed people, but with the intent to return to her in 2 years. Quote, "He went out with them because he was used to traveling, and it was necessary to have someone to assist and take care of them," she explained. The couple planned to finish paying off the cost of her manumission and claim their house upon his return. Their plan, however, assumed that Golson had intended for the real estate in his name to go to them, and that he would transfer it to them. Unfortunately, Eliza's husband died while abroad. She lost her husband and their plans for a future together. She also lost his help in paying for her freedom. So that's one example of some of the leniency that she received with Mr. Golson as her enslaver in Memphis. Now you'll notice in the affidavit, which starts on page 227, that she doesn't name anybody involved in her enslavement in full. There are only the names of the enslavers, Mr. Macklemore, Mr. Golson, and Colonel Christmas, or Mr. Christmas. So, when I decided that I wanted to write a biography of Eliza Winston, I figured that I needed to figure out the full names of these people. So, my first pressing question was, who exactly were Mr. Macklemore and Mr. Golson? Now, I have been studying my family tree as a hobby for a little over 20 years, so I knew that a website like Ancestry.com allows for people to search for people by putting in last names or surnames. And one of the features that the website has is that if you want to look up married couples, you can plug in the name of the groom, or at least the last name of the groom, and the last name of the bride, and then see what comes up. So the affidavit said that Eliza's first enslaver was Mr. Macklemore, and that later on his daughter's husband, Mr. Golson, inherited Eliza. So I knew that I had to find a married couple with the names Golson and Macklemore. And the only result that came up that fit Eliza's affidavit information about being enslaved in Tennessee was a man by the name of Thomas Golson and a woman by the name of Catherine Macklemore, or Kate Macklemore. But then I needed to figure out who is Mr. Macklemore. I know that Kate is Mr. Macklemore's daughter, but what's the full name of Mr. Macklemore? Another feature of these websites is that you can look up information that different members of the site have in their family trees to see if there are any descendants of the Macklemores. And through doing that, I found out that Kate Macklemore's father was named John Macklemore. So now I had my Mr. Macklemore and I had my Mr. Golson. So next I have to figure out if Mr. Macklemore and Mr. Golson really did enslave Eliza Winston. And that was the relatively easy part because now I had names. And I was able to look at census information and find out that John Macklemore lived in Nashville, but his daughter Kate and her husband Tom Golson lived in Memphis. So if I wanted to find any information related to Eliza Winston being enslaved then, I had to look up deeds for Davidson County, Tennessee, where Nashville is, and Shelby County, where Memphis is. And I was able to find some. deed for John McLemore buying Eliza in 1822 when she was 5 years old. And then I found a deed from 1834 from where John McLemore ran into some financial trouble and was ordered by the sheriff to sell off all his people, including Eliza, who was 17 by then. And then the most interesting deed I found was one where Eliza is purchased by Catherine McLemore, and it's not Mr. Golson or Thomas Golson who buys her, it's Kate who buys her. And she buys her from a man named Lucius Polk, who was the person who had bought all the people from Mr. McLemore 8 years earlier. And on page 223, that particular deed from 1842, where Kate inherits Eliza, had information that completely threw me for a loop. Just came out of left field. I wasn't expecting it at all. The deed from Lucius K. Polk to Mary Ann Walker, Kate's sister, and Catherine Wilson. Whereas on the 24th of July, 1834, there was sold at executor sale in the town of Nashville on the property of John C. McLemore all this household and kitchen furniture, together with the following Negro slaves: one Negro woman named Eliza, one Negro girl named Linda, and one Negro boy named Julius, which furniture and Negroes was purchased by me and paid for by General Andrew Jackson, with instructions that I convey the same to Mary Ann Walker for her separate use and to Catherine McLemore, now Catherine Golson. So once I read General Andrew Jackson, I thought, that General Jackson, President Jackson, was involved in this transaction? Why? Why is the president, who's actually in office in the White House in 1834, involved in this? So I had to figure out if there was any kind of connection that the McLemores had with President Jackson. So I went to different collections that had President Jackson's personal papers from when he was in the White House. I contacted the Hermitage, which was Andrew Jackson's plantation in Nashville, to see what records they had. And as it turns out, John McLemore was President Jackson's nephew-in-law, because McLemore married a woman named Betsy Donaldson, who was the niece of Andrew Jackson's wife. And President Jackson was very loyal and very committed to his wife and her family. And between him winning his first presidential election in November and moving into the White House the following March, because back then it was March and not January, his wife died. So he depended on his in-laws, his young in-laws, to serve as the first lady. So there was another niece who was much younger than McLemore's wife, Emily Donaldson, and then eventually John McLemore's oldest daughter, Mary, goes to the White House too, to serve as the first lady of sorts. But when McLemore purchases Eliza back in 1822, that's the start of the Donaldson family owning Eliza. And when Lucius Polk buys all the enslaved people that McLemore has to be dispossessed of, Lucius is married to another Donaldson, another grandniece-in-law named Mary Ann Easton. And this arrangement was made because in 1834, Kate was just 12 years old, so she wasn't old enough to inherit any property as an adult. So that's why the Polks held Eliza for 8 years. They were waiting for Kate to grow up and get married. And once that happens, then Eliza goes to live with Kate. But you have to keep in mind that since the Macklemores lost all their enslaved people when Kate was 12, she grew up not learning how to enslave people. So when she inherits Eliza, and she's living in urban Memphis, where you can't really have a big sprawling plantation, and therefore not a lot of enslaved people, she is way more lenient in her enslavement than any of Eliza's previous enslavers. They allow her to go to church by herself in Memphis, and I think that's where she learned to read, because she went to a Presbyterian church, and back then Presbyterians, at least in the South, were just fine with slavery, but they wanted enslavers to teach their enslaved people how to read and to educate them. Not only that, but in this church, Eliza worshiped with European Americans, or white people, who did not enslave very many people. There was one worshiper who was European American who didn't enslave anybody at all. And among some of the African Americans that she worshiped with, some of them were free. So she was able to see in this experience that not every European American wanted to enslave people and had no interest in enslaving her specifically. And she learned from being around free African Americans how to be free and how to live as a free person. So I think that was the beginning of her aspiring to that. And the leniency that Kate had, and then that her husband had after Kate died, allowed her to pursue that to the extent that she did in Memphis. Now, at some point, Thomas Golson ran into financial trouble. And in my research, I found that at around the fall of 1852, he went to New Orleans to take on a job as a newspaper correspondent, and he left Eliza alone in Memphis. So he was a long distance in slavery, which was not really that uncommon, especially in urban areas. But that job at the newspaper in New Orleans was just not enough money for him. So he made the decision to pawn her. He had a cousin named Richard Christmas. John's full name is John Christmas McElroy. So the Colonel Christmas, or the Richard Christmas, is related to John. And I think that perhaps at some point Thomas Golson was familiar with Colonel Christmas through his marriage to Kate, since Kate was a McElroy as well as a Donaldson and a Golson. I mentioned Eliza being literate, and the way that I learned about this was when I was doing a newspaper search in databases that digitized old newspapers. I plugged in the name Eliza Golson to see what would come up, if there would be any newspaper coverage of her. And the only article that I found in Memphis or in Tennessee altogether is actually not an article necessarily, but rather a listing. It used to be that post offices in different cities across the country would list the names of people who have letters waiting for them at the post office. So in Memphis in February 1853, there's a listing in the post office for a letter waiting for an Eliza Golson. So I figured nobody would write a letter to someone if they didn't think that that person was going to read it. So Eliza knew how to read by 1853. And I think that because the letter was addressed to Eliza Golson, that it was written by Thomas Golson, and that perhaps Thomas Golson said something to the effect of, "I'm coming to Memphis to get you to bring you to New Orleans and pawn you off." And that's exactly what happened. Now the Christmases, Richard Christmas and his wife Mary, so her name's Mary Christmas, they lived in Mississippi, but they came to New Orleans so that they could acquire Eliza from the pawn and bring her to the Deep South, which, if you know anything about slavery in the United States, was a region of the country that no enslaved person wanted to go to, certainly not in the condition of enslavement. There are stories about people living in the Upper South or the Mid-South who had companions who were sold away to the Deep South, or sold down the river, as people used to say. And they knew that those enslaved people were headed for a very hard life on these Delta plantations, and they were never coming back. So that was the fate that Eliza suffered, and 2 years into being in Mississippi, Thomas Golson died, so he was never able to buy back Eliza from having pawned her. So her condition of enslavement in the Deep South became permanent at that moment. Now, Mary Christmas was a very sickly woman, and she needed constant care, and in 1853 she became a mother for the first time. So Eliza served in a role as the baby's nurse. And the way that I was able to figure out that Eliza did indeed physically nurse the baby is that she said in her affidavit that she had both nursed and taken care of this baby. And I doubt that she would use both nurse and taken care of in the same sentence. She didn't strike me as a very redundant person than the rest of the affidavit. Also, I had studied tax records that Memphis used to keep annually, and there was one period where the Golson household had a specific number, and then one year that number of slaves went up, but there was no deed recording any purchase, so I figured that that new slave was a baby. So at some point Eliza became a mother. I don't know if the baby was lost or if the baby died or was sold away, but I figured that being a mother would have given her the milk necessary to nurse the Christmas baby years later. But again, Mary Christmas was sickly, and in 1860, she made the decision to go to Minnesota, in Minneapolis, or really it was called St. Anthony back then, because there were these waterfalls in St. Anthony that were promoted in the South as having these healing powers. So a lot of invalids came to Minneapolis back then, thinking that being by the falls would heal them. And Mary was one of those people. And out of all the 160 enslaved people that were on the plantation, the Christmases chose Eliza to go with them. Probably because the whole 7 years that Eliza had been in Mississippi, the Christmases isolated her to Mary's room, essentially, to take care of Mary and the baby. And Eliza talks in her affidavit about never really getting to see anybody because she was always taking care of Mary and the baby, whose name was Norma. Eliza is able to get a promise out of the Christmases that they will free her on the way from the Deep South to Minnesota. Now, are any of you familiar with what it would be like to travel on the Mississippi from the Deep South up to here, basically, Minnesota? No? Okay. Now, when you're starting from a place like Mississippi or Louisiana, and you're sailing up the Mississippi River, you don't stay on the same boat for the whole trip, all the way up to Minnesota. And the reason why is, when you're in the waters that border Mississippi and Louisiana and Arkansas and Tennessee and Missouri, you're in water that borders slave states. And back then, the steamboats at least in the Deep South, had crew members who were enslaved people who were on loan from various plantations. So those enslavers expected to have their slaves back once the trip was over. But if a boat were to go past St. Louis, which was the last slave city on the journey, then any stop that they made north of St. Louis would be next to a free state. So a crew member could just walk off the boat and be free. And there wouldn't be anything that the enslaver could do about it because they willingly put that slave on the boat. So, if you're traveling up the Deep South, up from the Deep South, you always stopped in St. Louis if you were going to go farther. So that's what the Christmases did. They got off the boat, got onto another boat, leaving from St. Louis, and this time the crew members were all European American, mostly European American. The ones who weren't were free. And then they just went the rest of the way up to Minnesota. Now, Eliza was under the impression that the Christmases were going to free them at the stop in St. Louis. So when they didn't, and they took her all the way up to Minnesota, she was very bitterly disappointed by that. So they arrive in Minneapolis in July of 1860. And within, I guess, a week of being here, a week or two, she's sent on an errand by the Christmases to a tailor's shop. And on the errand, she meets a local free African-American woman named Emily Gray. And, this is the first free person that she's seen in a long time, after 7 years in Mississippi. So she wastes no time in telling Emily about being enslaved by the Christmases. And Emily tells her, you are free, but let me help you be free to escape from your enslavers. And one of the things that Eliza asks Emily is, do you know any white men who can help me be free? Which I thought was a very curious thing to say, but when you think about it, that makes sense because it would only be European Americans who would be the lawyers and the judges, and probably the best connected abolitionists in Minnesota who could help her. And by this time, Emily has been in Minneapolis for a couple of years, and she's developed a network of abolitionist allies. So they come up with this plan to have Eliza go to a church that an abolitionist minister runs, and then at the end of the service, an abolitionist named William Babbitt will be outside the church by a coach, wearing a white glove, and then she's to go with him in that coach, and he'll take her, or at least he'll start her on her way to Canada. So, Emily tells Eliza this plan at her house, Emily's house. And since this was a secret meeting, I think that it would be appropriate for anyone to say that this house is essentially Eliza's first stop on what passes Minneapolis' Underground Railroad. And Eliza was so happy after she left Emily's house that she told at least one fellow slave at the hotel in St. Anthony about the plan. And somehow that plan traveled from that servant to the Christmases. I don't know if that particular servant snitched, but somebody did. So the Christmases found out, and they immediately left the hotel. Eliza had this trunk full of clothes that her free friends had given her, but the Christmases didn't allow her to take it with them when they left. They went 9 miles south to the town of Richfield and stayed at a lake house so they could hide from the abolitionist locals. But they were able to track her down. And Emily's abolitionist allies came up with a new plan for her freedom, which was to apply for what's called a writ of habeas corpus. And in a writ of habeas corpus, someone who is a prisoner in a cell or someone who's enslaved in a free state can petition a judge to protest his or her incarceration or imprisonment. And there was a sympathetic judge who accepted the writ. So the next step was to have the sheriff of Hennepin County go out and find Eliza at the lake house, bring her to the judge's courthouse where the hearing could take place. And one thing I didn't expect to see in that particular story is that the sheriff of Hennepin County was not a totally sympathetic figure, because he's one of the co-founders of the town of Cold Spring, Minnesota, which is not that far from St. Cloud. And another of the co-founders was a woman named Sarah Joden, and she and her husband enslaved people back in Virginia, and they might have taken one of their enslaved people with them to Minnesota. But regardless, they have finances that are tied up in slavery. So slavery money, or money from slavery, was part of the founding of Cold Spring. But because the sheriff is a business partner, he has no problem associating with them. So you can imagine his hesitancy, maybe even his frustration at having to go to the lake house where several enslavers are, and he's going to have to piss off one of them by essentially arresting Eliza just to bring her to the courthouse. And it does cause a scene. I talk in the book how at the time Eliza is wearing one of the two pieces of clothing that she has there. There's a washing dress and there's a finer calico dress. And when the sheriff comes to the lake house and says, "It's time for me to take you to court," Eliza changes out of the washing dress and puts on the calico dress. And I think that is her not only signaling that she's done working for the day, but that she's done with slavery itself. I think it's a very powerful moment, this changing of the dresses. So she goes to court, and Colonel Christmas is at the courthouse too, and he has another Southern guest with him who serves as his lawyer on the spot. And he tries to argue that anywhere an enslaver wants to take an enslaved person, even in free states, that's okay, but that's not the law. So instead, the lawyer that Eliza's friends had for her, according to legend, simply stood up, recited the part of the Constitution that banned slavery, and then sat down. And then the judge agreed with that law and said, "Eliza, you are free." And her allies celebrate, and she decides that she's going to be with them in her first moments of freedom. But that makes a lot of Minnesotans very angry. That makes the Southern tourists angry too, that they just catch the first boat back down to the south because they don't want their slaves to find a lawyer too. But the Minnesotans who are left behind, who had been dependent on all this revenue from tourists, they riot. They riot in the streets of Minneapolis, looking for the homes of the allies that Eliza had. But she was able to be safely quartered away from the mob in at least two houses. And one of the houses, the house of George Stone, sat where part of Augsburg University's campus is today, near the Liddell Library. And this was August of 1860. By November of 1860, most of the tourists had gone. The Mississippi River's about to freeze. So her allies take her to St. Paul, and then from St. Paul, she goes to Detroit. And she spends the rest of her life as a free woman in Detroit. One of the things that fascinated me about Eliza and the things that she said in print, whether it was her affidavit or different newspaper articles about her was just how aware she was of her monetary value and value of her labor. And my favorite quote about this is on page 192. Some Southern newspapers resorted to fiction to portray the Christmases as benevolent victims of Northern anti-slavery hostility. While Eliza's own account noted that Richard Christmas gave her $10 before the court proceedings began, some articles reported that he handed money to her after the post-trial conversation, $50 from him and at least $40 from his wife, and then walked away for the last time from the woman he enslaved. However, none of the affidavits submitted after the hearing mentioned any gift of money from Christmas to her after the hearing ended. Moreover, Winston herself claimed that the exchange never happened. William Babbitt, one of the abolitionists, remembered. On hearing the rumor that he gave her $50, she denied it, but said she wished he had, as he really owed her more than that. So I will close with the closing of the book, the last paragraph on page 214. The most powerful aspect of Winston's legacy is her ability to find outlets for agency and ultimately liberation amid the multiple changes in her enslavement. Her literacy and her semi-free life in Memphis, her hard work with her husband, her continued striving for freedom under the Christmases, all these show that she was not helpless in pursuing her own liberation, nor a powerless captive completely deferring to whomever enslaved her. She prepared herself, and by the time she had, finally, a chance for freedom, she both knew what to do and had the courage to do it. And Eliza Winston's life, when traced through all the states in which she resided, shows that hers is less a Minnesota story and more an American story. So that's all I have. I will take your questions and comments now. Who'd like to go first? Yes.
How long did it take you to gather all the research and, well, I mean, all the stuff you did in order to produce it?
It took 4 years.
4 years?
Right. My other book, Slavery's Reach, had just come out, and I was hearing from people who had read the book that they were impressed with my research, but that I didn't give them a hero. I didn't give them someone to root for, which is good because the subtitle of the book is Southern Slaveholders, so that's good that those aren't your protagonists. But the point was taken, so I figured, well, I know that in Slavery's Reach I wrote about different people who had been enslaved in Minnesota and who became free. So if I find someone who has the most of a paper trail, then maybe I can write a book about that person. And Eliza Winston by far had the biggest paper trail, so I chose to write about her.
I'm sorry, just to follow up, but do you cover, I know you talk about Emily Goodrich
Yes.
as well, do you cover her in depth as
Yes,
well?
I do.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
That's great.
especially in the chapter when they meet
Okay.
at her business. I talk about how she was born free in Pennsylvania, and that her father had been born enslaved but became free, and that when she was a kid, her parents would welcome fugitive slaves at their house. So they were very much in the abolition movement.
Yeah.
So Emily just brought that experience with her from Pennsylvania to Minnesota. In fact, she named her son after the Haitian revolutionary, Toussaint Louverture. His name was Toussaint Gray. And she thinks that he might have been the first African-American boy, at least, born in Minneapolis. Yes?
Sorry, I missed the early part. Did you discuss how you went from Minnesota to the South to find the lady, and that was what the research track that took you there?
Well, fortunately, William Green, in his book Peculiar Imbalance, did a lot of the legwork for the research about Eliza pursuing her freedom in Minnesota. So what I wanted to do was see everything that I could find about her life before coming here. And perhaps one of the things that really made me stop in my tracks was noticing that in her affidavit she said that essentially she was born in 1830, but the deeds that I found where the people she mentions in the affidavit sold her, they put her age as someone being born in 1817. So instead of being freed at the age of 30, she was freed at the age of 43. So when I found the discrepancy, I worked really hard to make sure that it was the same Eliza and that Eliza didn't perhaps name a daughter after herself. And in my research, essentially figured out that there's no way that that could have happened, because if Eliza had a daughter in 1830, she would have been mentioned in the receipt for the 1834 sale. So it was just a lot of forensic work between the deeds and the census records and the newspaper accounts and what I could find in archives at the State Historical Society. But I was just so determined to write this story about someone who was able to successfully pursue her freedom and to find justice in court as an African American in 1860. This was a book that I was just really driven to write, and I really enjoyed the process of doing that. Yes?
Did you find any new breadcrumbs on Eliza's life after she left Minnesota?
Yes. The way that I know that she stayed in Detroit is that there was another newspaper listing from the post office. This time it was in Detroit, I think in 1861, and it was a letter for Eliza Winston. And then the other evidence I found was a city directory for Detroit in 1862 that lists Eliza Winston working as a nurse in Detroit. So she was able to have the labor that she wanted to, and she was able to live in a substantial free African American community, because Detroit was one of the last cities in the United States before going to Canada. I mean, the only thing that she wanted to do but wasn't able to do was go back to Memphis and work as a nurse girl. Number one, she couldn't do that because the law was still that if you were free, you had to go to Liberia if you were in Tennessee. And the other reason she couldn't do that is because she didn't have a home to go back to, because her home was in Thomas Goldsmith's name, and there was no way for Eliza to claim it as an African American, let alone as a slave. So she stayed in Detroit at least 2 years after being freed in Minnesota. I don't know how long she lived ultimately, but at least part of that life was in Detroit. Any other questions or comments do you have?
I think that was amazing when we were able to find the trail to Andrew Jackson. Like, what was your, I know you said it was surprising, but did you kind of like double check, triple check?
I certainly did. I looked through indexes of the volumes of Jackson's papers to make sure that he mentions Macklemore, and he does quite a bit. There are even occasions where Macklemore receives letters from Jackson and writes to Jackson. On at least one occasion, Jackson invited Macklemore himself to the White House for a visit. And then ultimately, Macklemore's daughter, Mary, becomes a first lady for about a year. And this is in 1832, excuse me. So in 1832, John Macklemore still owns Eliza. And Eliza and Mary Macklemore are the same age. So Mary was 5 when Eliza, at age 5, came to the house, and they grew up together. But Eliza was able to see through the things that Mary was able to do that she wasn't, just how different being free was, especially being free and being tied or connected to the most powerful man in the country. Yes.
Was Eliza able to stay connected to the community in Minnesota that once she moved to Detroit? Because I know you mentioned that she wanted to move back to Tennessee, but was there any correspondence between her and the Minnesota community afterwards?
I think there was. I wasn't able to verify people's accounts because quite a few of her allies in Minnesota wrote about her for years. And as late as the 1880s and 1890s, people will say, oh, I just visited Eliza in Detroit. She's doing well. She's remarried. She has another family now. But there's just no way to verify that because the census records of 1870 and 1880 didn't seem to correspond with that. But at the same time, I know that she lived in Detroit for at least 2 years into her freedom, so it's not that much of a stretch for me to think that she just stayed there as opposed to going back to the South after becoming free. Any other questions or comments?
Deep appreciation for their work. You know, about, what was it, 15 or so years ago, I worked when the African American Museum was getting ready to, Sarah Roxanne Giddens was pulling that together. We did a trumpet on Emily Goodrich, where they had like a reenactor who kind of would take this trunk around and had little parts of the history, and we didn't have a lot of history, but there was a school, a charter school that had opened up called Emily Goodrich Prayer, and so that was like our first stop in doing that, being able to go there and, you know, teach the students that, you know, this is an actual person. And so I think a lot of times we have names on things and we don't even know who they belong to and why. And so appreciate your deep research because it helps make a lot of connections for those of us who are trying to make connections. So
Thank you. It was certainly, again, my pleasure to do the research for this story.
yeah.
I consider Eliza to perhaps be the third most or best known enslaved person in Minnesota after Dred Scott and Harriet Scott.
Yeah.
But there's not that much that's known about her besides her her time in Minnesota. She actually was enslaved in Minnesota for 40 days and 40 nights, believe it or not. Because I looked at the date of the register at the hotel when they arrived, and then the date of when the judge declared her free, and it was exactly 40 days.
Wow.
Not exactly anything. Yeah, I remember kind of stumbling across her story a few years ago, and this wasn't much, and then decided was it last year at the History Center. And the book hadn't been published yet, but we had a talk there, and so really excited to read it.
Thank you.
More of her story.
Well, I have already autographed copies of the book that the bookstore has, but if you want a more want a personalized autograph, then I can do that. And if you brought copies with you, then I can autograph those too.
Thank you very much.
It's raining, stay dry.